everybody. Welcome to another episode of the LitRPG podcast. This is episode number 42, and I'm Ramon Mejia. I'm here to bring you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and of course, author interviews. And now, before we get into the podcast, I want to give a quick shout out to the podcast's three newest Patreon supporters, the amazing gentlemen all around. We have Michael Chatfield, Matt Dinneman, and Justin Scott. Now, Justin Scott has pledged $1 a month. Thank you very much, man. And both Michael and Matt have decided to give $10 a month to help support the podcast and help us cover our expenses. So all you guys, amazing. Thank you very much. Amazing supporters. It's always surprising to me when people are willing to say, hey, here's some money to do the thing that you like to do. So thanks a lot, guys. Now, for the folks who give $10 a month, that's the highest rank that I have on the Patreon for the podcast at this point. I didn't think anyone would actually pay it, but people are. So great. I call it God Rank Geek Level. And you get three things. You get a wish video where they can ask me to do some silly or fun thing, and I will do it. I will record it, and I will put it up on the Patreon page for those people to enjoy. They also get a 15-minute Skype conversation if they want it. Oddly enough, very few people have taken me up on that offer. And three, they get to decide the next movie that I'll be recording a commentary track for. So that's something in just the Patreon supporters get as just a special thank you of thanks for supporting the podcast and the thing that I love to do. So thanks a lot. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Matt, for your support. If anybody else wants to support the podcast on Patreon, then go to patreon.com/geekbytespodcast, which is the big heading for this podcast and the other one that I do. There you go. Okay, now this week I will be reviewing The Goblin Shadow, Awaken and Precipice, Legends of Tarthirious, Book 3 of Kylia's story, additionally the Weirdest Noob, which is a Russian translation, Destined, and Ring of Promise. So those are the 6 novels that I'll be reviewing this week. We're going to begin our show though with LitRPG news. And first in LitRPG news, we have a friend of the podcast, Luke Chmalenko, who we interviewed a couple times, I believe, for the show. Author of the Ascend Online series. He stated publicly that he plans to release book 2 in the series, Hell to Pay, on March 1st, 2017. Don't have any cover art or anything for it, but he does have early chapters that are available currently for his Patreon supporters at patreon.com/Luke Chmalenko. And if you can't spell that, the link is in the show notes. Okay, also in LitRPG news, recently released Awaken Online, Precipice is doing amazing on the Amazon charts. I'm always happy to report this kind of amazing success. The Awaken Online series actually occupies the top 3 spots in cyberpunk sci-fi. Awaken Online Precipice ebook is number 1, the audiobook is number 2, and the first book in that series, Catharsis, is number 3. So that's really great for you, Travis Bagwell, who's the author. So congratulations, man, on that amazing success. Travis is also actually reducing the price of book 1 in the series to 99 cents temporarily. So if you haven't read the series or you've been waiting for a price drop, go pick it up now. It's a great deal, amazing story, and then you can immediately jump into book 2, of course. Okay, also, Michael Scott Earl, author of the Lion's Quest series, has released the cover art for his 3rd book, titled Trinity. It features a gnome berserker on the cover, so very nice, a very pretty cover. So thank you very much. Okay, out this recently released for LitRPG audiobooks. We have a few listeners to specifically like audiobooks as a LitRPG, so here's a list for you. Steel Wolves of Kradia, Realm of Archon Book 3 just came out. Awaken Online Precipice, the audiobook is out at the same time that the ebook is out, so perfect for you folks. Dungeonborn, the first book in the Divine Dungeon series, is out as an audiobook as well. And as of March 31st, when most people will be actually listening and watching the podcast, these 2 books are also going to be out on audiobook. The Beginning, which is the first book in the Dark Paladin series by Vasily Mihenko, and Video Game Plotline Tester, the first book in the Dark Herbalist series, which I really enjoyed as an ebook and I can't wait to listen to as an audiobook. That will also be out on March 31st. Okay, also out this week, but not reviewing, Valhalla Online, Digital Me, New Horizons, which is the 4th book in the Amarillo series. The 2nd book in the Galactic Fist of Legend series is out as well. And World Keeper, Birth of a World, which is the latest novel from Justin Miller, I believe. So looking forward to reading that one this next week as well. Now, in upcoming LitRPG, Earth Tactic Advance Volume 1 is supposed to be out now, but maybe in the next few days, maybe the beginning of April, I don't know. Also coming out on April 1st, 2017, Earth Online, Memoirs of Lawrence Wrath. This is a very interesting concept that also has I believe it's a Spotify playlist that goes along with the ebook. So apparently it's meant to listen to music and read the story at the same time. So it's a very interesting concept. Look forward to checking it out when it comes out on the 1st. On April the 2nd, however, the 5th book in the Way the Shaman series, the Commandant chess set, is going to be dropping. Delver's LLC Obligations Incurred will also be out on April the 7th, 2017. Dominion of Blades out on April the 11th. This Is Our Land, Book 5 in the Amarillo series, will be out on April the 25th. And there you go. And of course, we talked about Hell to Pay, which will be out on May the 1st. And again, anything out past beyond that, there's a ton of stuff for May, June. So you can check that out at our website, geekpasspodcast.com. We'll have in our recommendation list for LitRPG, we'll have a upcoming LitRPG list, and also on our Facebook page for the LitRPG podcasts, the upcoming LitRPG list is also there as well, going out as far as we have information for things. Okay, on to new releases and reviews. Okay, first story in new releases and reviews that I'll be reviewing is The Goblin Shadow, a LitRPG series. It is written by Kyle Voss. Okay, it is 198 pages, $2.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Now, the main character, Tom, hates his job. He has a boss that he loathes, and his fiancée just left him, and she took the dog. I know. He plans to pay off his massive debt that she left him with and move to the Bahamas. The only problem, he doesn't make enough money at his current job. So he has a side gig of creating, leveling, and selling off characters in the virtual reality MMO Inferno Omega. Now, one day while leveling up a special request character, a Shadow Walker, he runs into a goblin that seems much smarter than the average mob. Now, instead of killing him, for the experience points, he instead goes on a series of adventures with him that help him heal some of his emotional traumas. So it's a very cute premise, and I like that section of it where it's about healing emotional scars for the character. Really think cool things. Among other things that I enjoyed about the story, the character class of a Shadow Walker is really cool, really neat abilities, with some low-level spells that he can use, that the main character actually uses rather intelligently, which is always a big plus for me. I don't generally like it when a character seems overpowered. This is not. So it's a good character class abilities. Now, the second character, Gabber the Goblin. I really like that character. He was fun. He was interesting. He was intelligent, witty, smart, lovable to the nth degree. And I liked him more than any other character, including the main character in this story, which is maybe a problem. Let's see. And of course, a big thing for me is that that character, Gabber the Goblin, also has problems, but he doesn't whine about them. And he has plans to solve them. He even has a cool monster taming skill that he uses to get out of situations where he uses brain overrun. So always good character traits, in my opinion. They're very decent combat scenes written. Some of the monster spots are really interesting, and the way the characters spot them, also cool and unique. So big pluses for me. Now, some things that I didn't like so much about the story. The main character spends a great deal of time kind of whining and telling us about his problems and exactly why he doesn't trust anyone and why he prefers to be alone, which is fine, but it kind of goes on for a little too long for me. I get that the author is trying to establish character flaws that will be fixed later, but again, it just kind of goes on a little too long for my personal taste. Now, the main bad guy, Crawford, He's never really that interesting. And he kind of comes off as an entitled, we'll say jerk. Which would really be fine if that's all the author tried to make him. There's also an attempt at making the reader empathize with him as a character by describing how he was neglected as a child by his rich father, that he only really wants his father's attention, and he secretly does nice things for other people while they aren't looking. But for that to kind of work, we kind of need to see either Crawford's point of view or at least get some conversations with him that create a counterpoint to his consistently snotty behavior in the game. So it doesn't really work out that well. And the game world overall isn't really that fleshed out. I can remember a few of the environments, the forest, a cave system, but none of it really sticks in my mind as being particularly memorable. Overall, Goblin Shadow was an interesting read. It's not bad in any, respect. But the fact that I really did like Gobbert the Goblin more than any other character kind of says something about the story. I would rather have read a story about him in particular because he was just that much more interesting than the main character, unfortunately. But overall, the Goblin Shadow gets a 7 out of 10 for me. Okay. On to Awaken Online, Precipice by Travis Bagwell. This is the second book in the Awaken Online series. It is 481 pages, $6.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Now I'm going to read you the author's description of the story. A few days have passed since Jason's confrontation with Alfred, and he's debating whether to re-enter Awaken Online. Alfred has made a proposition that Jason isn't certain that he should accept. After the battle with Alexion, Jason has also been appointed as the regent of the Twilight Throne. He must assume the mantle of ruling an undead city with everything that entails. His first task is to investigate the dark keep that looms over the city's marketplace. This act will lead to a chain of events that might ensure his city's survival or create new enemies. Now, full disclosure, I got an advanced copy of Awaken Online Precipice from the author review, but I picked it up on Kindle Limited when it became available. Additionally, the ebook and the audiobook are out at the same time, which is really awesome. I'm not sure how the author was able to swing it, but it's a really great dual release. I've listened to the audiobook and I liked it. It's really good as the ebook, with the exception for me of some of the sound effects when notifications come up. That's not my thing, but other than that, great audiobook in addition to an ebook. Now, overall review of the novel, in just about every way, book 2 in the Awaken Online series is better than the first, which is hardly seems possible. I really liked book 1. The author gets right into the game world and not only provides a ton of action, but the story also makes the reader think. Not too much, but at least a little, which is to me the mark of a great story. This is a smaller, more intimate story than book 1 and focuses on basically 2 narratives. 1, Team Undead, which comprises Jason, Frank, and Riley, and how they work to solve the problems that face the new undead kingdom, growing the population when the undead can't procreate. They come up with some very interesting solutions, which I won't spoil, but they also, each one of those characters also finds themselves influenced by the opportunities created by the Dark Deity, which is a portion of the artificial intelligence creating the game. So basically, the game is influencing them. It's not taking away their free choice in any way, shape, or form, but it's reading their minds and looking at their histories and trying to and creating situations within the game system that makes them, I don't want to say better people because it's not necessarily, but it's definitely influencing the way that they're behaving, or at least giving these characters an opportunity to make choices in the virtual world that they never had in real life, and it's influencing their behavior. But it's a cool premise, a really interesting way of thinking about artificial intelligence's possible influence on our daily lives. Now, the second narrative in the story is for Team Evil Sociopath. That's Alex. He's the rich kid bad guy from the book 1. And he is also a very interesting part of the story. He lost the battle in book 1. That's not a spoiler. It's in the description from the author. But what he does after that kind of makes the reader think if they want to. And the author gives them an opportunity to kind of think about some very interesting themes. Alex has an opportunity for redemption within the story, but again, it's a choice he has to make, whether he's going to go down that path or the path of destruction and conquering, and kind of go back to his sociopathic nature or that side of him. And it's a very interesting journey for both those narrative plot lines. There's a ton of cool stuff in the story, but I can't, talk about without spoiling it for everybody. But I can assure you that even just those two narratives are really cool and interesting and worth your time. There's action, adventure, skills, levels, zoots, all the stuff that I love. And the main character, again, uses his brain. He just doesn't spam out abilities or hack and slash. Nothing's wrong with that, but I love an intelligent character who maximizes the skills and tools available to him. So really love that. And the main character very rarely takes the obvious path in the storyline. And again, speaking about the things that the author provides for the reader to think about, he brings up some really interesting philosophical questions about the nature of good and evil and how we as individuals and societies and groups define them. He talks about a lot of sociological concepts like moral relativism, social contracts, and the agreed upon cultural norms of what's good and bad and evil and righteous. Is good what really just benefits ourselves? Is bad what harms us? Do good acts mean a good person? Can a person be judged evil without actually seeing their intentions? There are some religious notes in the story, and a little bit, heavy-handed occasionally, but they do provide a very interesting point of view in that just because something looks good doesn't really necessarily make it good by someone's definition necessarily. And is redemption really possible for everybody, or are they predetermined to go down a path of darkness because of predispositions or genetic disorders, or a broken backstory or broken history or emotional state? These are questions that are posed, and they're not necessarily answered. And the author leaves room for the audience and the reader to kind of think about them and answer them for themselves as they're reading the story, which I love. Now, again, because of the great action, adventure, and the fact that it makes you think a little bit, it's a great story. It gets an almost perfect score. It gets a 9 out of 10 for me. So thank you, Travis Bagwell, for writing such an amazing story. Okay, on to our next review, Legends of Tarthirious, Book 3 of Kylia's story. This is a serial story. It's not... Each one of these novels is not particularly long, and quality has been variable depending on the book. We'll get into that in a minute. Okay, 120 pages, 99 cents, great price point. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Okay, while this is a short read, again, priced well, of the 3 books in the serial so far, this is my favorite. It's not still particularly amazing, but this story is still more focused on the parts that I found to be the most interesting in the series. Now, in the game, Kylia is continuing to try to pay off her debt before her deadline, but is becoming less and less sure that she'll actually make it. And so she's trying to kind of shifting focus from just being frantic and taking any job she can and not really completing any of them, or just being distracted everywhere. She's kind of focusing on just enjoying the time she has left. And if she makes it, she makes it. She's kind of just playing for fun sometimes. Her character in game completes a series of class quests, gains some really cool magic skills and items, which really is the most progression that the character makes when she stopped trying to maximize things and just enjoyed the storyline and went on quests and completed them. Her character actually grew a lot more than it did when she was being frantic in other stories, in other books, I should say. Now, outside of the game, she's still recovering from the assassination attempt on her. That's right, assassination attempt. And her relationship with Gerald takes the next step as they both realize that their time together will end if Kylie is deported in the next couple of weeks. It's a cute love story. I mean, that portion of it is always adorable, and the author does that really well. Now, the game time and the real world time feel more connected this time around, since Kylie's emotional state carries through in both worlds, as do her issues with her boyfriend. It's really just nice to see the characters not really worry that much about the larger social and real world conditions, because remember in book 1 it's established that in England the government is taken over by a private agency and the national debt has to be paid off by its citizens by a certain date individually, or they're kicked out of the country. And so it's a very big social concept. And it loomed in books 1 and 2, and it's less pronounced in book 3, which is good for me because that was not interesting to me. I mean, it's a cool concept, and I get that there are ties into the game and it provides motivation for the character, but it was never as interesting as game stuff to me in general. And so it is played down a little bit more, but it still exists. But it doesn't take up nearly as much time in the story, and it really provides motivation at the end of the story to bait you into book 4, which I'll be reading. So overall, again, really decent read. I enjoyed it because I've been reading books 1 and 2, of course, and so I'm connected to the characters. And overall, I give it a score of 7 out of 10. So there you go. Okay, on to the next story, The Weirdest Noob by Arthur Stone. This is actually a pseudonym for a Russian author. It's been translated from Russian into English. So be aware up front that there are occasionally some translation issues. Not a lot, very, very occasionally, to be honest. But there are also some social concepts that don't always make sense to Western audiences or Americans especially. But again, it's a fun Russian story. It is 347 pages about. Amazon doesn't have an exact page count for the story. It is $2.99. It is not available on Kindle Unlimited. So, again, if you've ever read The Way of the Shaman, Alter World, The Daily Grind, you're going to find a lot of familiar elements at the very beginning of the story that you might recognize a little bit. I still enjoy the story, but the first 10% of it was kind of a drag. I'll read you the author's description of the story, just so you have an idea of what the narrative is about. Something quite odd is happening in Second World, the planet's foremost MMORPG. Something that's causing alliances to be broken and friendships forgotten. A worthless, low-level mine becomes a stage of vicious battles. Its burned ruins suddenly contested by the game's toughest clans. Every border is controlled and every road in the province blocked off. The weak players and the NPCs alike are subjected to non-stop violent raids courtesy of Eastern invaders. And the strong are scouring the virtual world for the culprit, the weirdest noob the game has ever seen. Okay, so that's kind of the premise. I'll give you a better description in a little bit. The main character of the story had an accident. His mind was sent to live off in the game while his medical science progresses to the point where it could bring him out of his induced coma and fix him. He has a limited account, kind of like the one you found in the Daily Grind series, that restricts his level but lets him get some work done in a mine. What sets him apart from everyone else, though, is his race, which has several unique abilities that he has no idea how to utilize because he's such a noob. Now, what I just described to you was my summary of essentially the first 10% of the story. The first 10% of the story is kind of a drag because it sets all this up. And while the premise is set up very well, because the main character isn't familiar with this kind of game, virtual reality MMORPG, that first 10% really does yell out noob about the main character. And I mean, it emphasizes his noobishness a ton. Like practically every other sentence in this section is a declaration of the main character's noobhood. Other characters yell at him. They call him noob left and right. And it's really emphasized that he doesn't know what he's doing necessarily. Which means, of course, for the readers that he is more likely to take different approaches in solving problems because he doesn't know the right way to necessarily solve a problem according to traditional game mechanics. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of defining of gaming terms, and I mean a lot of defining, like words like trains, mobs, levels, descriptions, particular stats. There's a ton of, it almost reads like a primer for MMOs within the first 10%. And if you're familiar with these terms already, you can probably skip the first 10%. What I've described to you already covers all the backstory, covers why he's in a mine, all that good stuff. Now, you actually get your first combat scene about 15% into the story. And after that point, things really progress nicely. There's tons of action and the storyline gets really interesting and it starts to differentiate itself from those other series that I've already kind of mentioned. The main character really starts utilizing his unique abilities, raising his stats, gathering resources. He does crafting, kills some mobs. It's a simple, fun story. It's not super complicated. It doesn't get too guilty and political. And I basically finished the entire story in a couple settings, which kind of just tells you as the audience that I enjoyed it, and that it was an easy read, it was fun, and which is what I'm looking for in a LitRPG generally. Yeah, that's it. Pretty much it. You may have to skip past the first 10% of the novel, but it does get better after that. So I say that because it's not in Kindle Unlimited, and if people are judging this by the sample they get, which is generally the first 10%, they might not go past that. But it's a good story. I enjoyed it. It gets a 7 out of 10 for me. Okay, next story, Destined, a LitRPG novel. It's the first book in the Destined Realms series. Written by Kylia L. Green. I don't know if that matters, but that's on the title book. Okay, it is about 200 pages. Again, Amazon doesn't have a specific page listing for it yet. It is $4.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Now, I'll read you the author's description of the novel. I wasn't the girl that cowered in the back, waiting for her knight in shining armor. I was the girl that wore the armor. Jolie Quinn woke up in a strange room and she couldn't remember how she got there. In fact, she couldn't remember much of anything at all. When she strikes out in search of answers, she's thrust into a fantasy world with swords, sorcery, and enemies that want to kill her just because they can. Jolie must not only quest to find the answers she seeks, but she must also survive in this world of untold dangers. With the help of others like her, will Jolie and her new friend be able to survive the fantasy world they are trapped inside of, or will they be destined to stay there forever? Okay, so it's a very interesting premise, but it reads like trapped in a fantasy story, which we'll get to as an issue for me. Now, just talking about the price, $4.99 for about 200 pages. It's not the best price point for me. It's a little overpriced at over 2 cents a page. I generally look for a good deal at about 1 cent a page, but that's me personally. It is on Kindle Unlimited, so if you have that, great. Go check it out. It's a nice read. But be aware that the last 10% of the novel is appendix and a preview of an unrelated novel from the author. Now, the first few pages of the novel are really engaging, and I was pleased to have a female main character in the story. Now, unfortunately, as the story went on, something about it just kept bothering me, and it took me a little while to figure it out, to be honest. This is never really clear in the story, but it's transported to a fantasy world, ruled by RPG mechanics, or trapped in the game mechanics. I'm not really sure. And it's not really made 100% clear, although it's implied that it's the latter, that they're actually trapped in a game. It's never really made clear. Again, that's one of the issues I have with the story. And again, as I was reading the story, I liked the first few pages. But again, something just kept bothering me. And as I was reading it, I kept realizing that there's a lot of implied game mechanics in the story, and I should say, there are some obviously city game mechanics. This is LitRPG. I have 2 qualifiers for LitRPG. One, that it's set in a game world with obviously city game mechanics, and 2, the characters progress according to those game mechanics in an obvious way. This novel qualifies for those 2 loose definitions of what LitRPG is to me. So I'm not saying it's not. But not all of the game mechanics are obviously stated. There's just enough that it feels like a fantasy story with just enough game mechanics that are obviously stated qualify as LitRPG. And whether or not that's the intention of the author, I can't say or not, but that's what was bothering. And it just took me a little while to figure it out, because there are character sheets, there are health bars, there are health, strength stats, depending on the character. They get abilities. There are eventually item descriptions for a few items, I should say. But then outside of that, there's almost no game mechanic descriptions. It's just within the context of the story, each one of these characters has a book that essentially acts as a character sheet and as a way for the game mechanics to be explained to these various characters, these characters in the story. But outside of that little book, there's almost no game mechanic description. And because there are almost these two competing concepts, fantasy story and, video game mechanics, they kind of clash in my mind as a lit RPG reader. And that's really what bothered me the most about the story. Overall, it's really well written. It's nice descriptions. I like the main character very much from the very get-go. She was engaging. She was interesting. Jolie is a fighter. She's tough. She leads the group, but she's also almost a den mom to these lost characters who don't have memories. But the fact that a lot of these game mechanics are implied and not revealed to me in full detail and their full LitRPG gloriousness, that didn't fulfill what I like the most about LitRPG. And I'll give you some examples of this. It is implied that not everyone in this world is a player character, that they're NPCs. It's described that these other people, these other entities, don't have the same light in their eyes as the people in this group of players. So it's implied that they're NPCs, but it's never actually stated, which is weird to me because in most LitRPG, the characters just say, "Oh, they're an NPC," and they may define what an NPC is, but because it's just implied, it always kind of stuck out of my mind. Like, why don't you just say that they're non-player characters? It's implied that experience points are given out at the end of a quest or for defeating a monster. But again, it's never actually stated. You can kind of figure it out if you look at the character sheets that are for the main character that are at the end of each chapter. But there's no game notifications. The book, each character has buzzes when they level up, and they just get improved stats, health, stamina, magic, whatever it is, maybe a new ability. But that's kind of the extent of that. It's also implied that characters go on quest, but I never get a quest description. It's just they meet a person, they tell them about a problem, and they say, "Help me, you're my only hope." But you never get like an actual quest description either in the book itself or as a pop-up notification, which again kind of bothered me because it really felt like a lot of the number stuff is in the background, which is fine. I don't require that as LitRPG, but I do like to know as much as possible about the game world. That's one of the things I love about RPGs in general and about LitRPG specifically, is that I can understand how the game world works. I can understand the rules. I can understand all the ability options possibly, or the character classes and what they can do and what they're good at, and which spells work the best, and which weapons work the best against certain types of monsters, all that great stuff. I'm the kind of guy who loved reading Dungeons and Dragon manuals for fun, just because I liked reading about all the minutiae about the stuff behind the scenes. So when I don't get that, it kind of bothers my gamer brain a little bit. And that's just me. I'm not saying this story isn't good for a lot of other people. A lot of people who don't like number crunching, who don't like numbers in their story, will probably enjoy it a lot more than I will. That I did, I should say. But for me, it almost felt like the author was hedging her bets. And by not including all this stuff, was trying to not make it too LitRPG or too gamified. Maybe this is a valid concern of hers because she does have an established reader base. She's written a bunch of other things. She has another series. And some of her readers might not enjoy this book because it's too gamey or it's too LitRPG and they don't understand that stuff, which is a valid concern for any author who does this for a living. I get that. But for me, as a LitRPG reader, I love seeing that stuff. That's why I read this type of material, is because I love getting that information. And just because in general, I couldn't connect to the game world. I couldn't think of how to roll my game, a game character in this world. I didn't enjoy it as much as I had hoped I would. There's actually a line in this story that actually aptly describes how I felt about it. Jolie, the main character, says, "At least we all understood the frustrations of not knowing. But I didn't feel they had the same need for the answers that I did. I didn't have a choice. I needed to know." And for me, that's how I feel about game mechanics in this story and about game mechanics in LitRPG in general. I need to know them. That's why I'm here. That's why I love reading LitRPG, is for those things. The game world to me is a character that should be described as in detail as an actual main character in the story. Again, that's a personal preference. This is LitRPG. It's not crunchy. Some people will describe it as LitRPG light because there's not a lot of numbers floating around. But for me, there's also not a lot of game mechanics that are described. They're implied, like a lot of implication about them, about characters' abilities, the things they can and can't do, because they're kind of pegged into certain classes and they can't vary. There's no multi-classing. There's no skill choices. They just get abilities and they use them what they don't. There's not a lot of agency in that respect for these characters. And that also bothered me as well a little bit, but that was less of a point for me than the fact that most of the game mechanics and story aren't shown. They're not described to me so that I understand how the game world works. And for me, that's an issue. So if it wasn't for the likable main character, to be honest, the story would be kind of meh. A lot of it felt on the rails. It didn't feel like the characters had a ton of agency. I feel like they were just going from quest to quest because they had to, or they figured they need to. And it didn't make sense to me why some of them couldn't have, gone in different paths. There are 5 different characters: a healer, a fighter, a rogue, a mage, and an archer. And they're all pegged in those classes when they wake up. And they never get any choice about what they're going to be as far as a character class. And they also don't get a ton of, in my opinion, choice as to where they're going to go in the story, as far as like what quests they're going to go. They all just happen to be on the same quest line, following this quest chain, and they all meet up with the main character and they form a group. And it feels very on the rails to me. So for those reasons, again, it's not a bad story. It just didn't really work for me for the reasons that I talked about already. It gets a 6 out of 10. Okay, on to the next story. Ring of Promise, a LitRPG novel by 2 authors, J.B. Garner and J.A. Cipriano, who we've reviewed other stories for. Okay, it is 269 pages. It is $4.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Now, I will read you the description of the story. Unlike real life, Max is pretty good at playing games, so when a new limited time dungeon opens up in the virtual reality game he plays, boasting a huge cash prize, Max knows he needs to try and complete it if he wants to be able to pay this month's rent. Fortunately, the only guild strong enough to attempt it to take it on before the timer runs out needs a tank, which he happens to be. There's just one problem. He's never played with them before, and even if he convinces the Sisters of Artemis to let him join in time to tank the dungeon and collect the prize money, if they wipe, it's all over. Now that would be bad because without the prize money, both he and his baby sister will be sleeping in a cardboard box under a bridge, and Max really hates sleeping in cardboard boxes. Been there, done that, sold the t-shirt. Okay. That essentially is the premise of the story. Again, 296 pages, $4.90. It's, again, slightly more than I usually like to pay for a story, but again, on Kindle Unlimited, so it's a good deal if you're on that program. Now, again, quick heads up, the last 6% of the novel is an appendix and a sample of another unrelated story, so just be aware of that. There are a lot of things I liked in the story. Well, we'll say a lot, but there are a lot of things that I didn't enjoy about the story as well. We'll start with things I liked. Even though the main character is in a wheelchair in real life, he never comes off as being whiny. This is always an issue for me. In an attempt to make the character relatable or at least empathetic, a lot of authors give the character some sad, sob backstory, which is fine, but sometimes it just goes on too long. And in this case, I like the way that the authors, plural, did the backstory of the character. He is in a wheelchair. He was in a car accident. Him and his sister lost their parents, and they both have disabilities and issues, but they don't whine about it. They're just like, this is how we are. We live our lives. We're on medical disability with the country, so we're on limited money. We can't get jobs at the places because they can't do physical labor. And so the main character has to do gaming to make money. But again, he doesn't use his condition as an excuse to whine. It's just, I got to do what I got to do. These are my limitations that I work with, which I really liked. So I like that part of the story a lot. The combat in the story is really top notch, very well described, lots of numbers. If you're into that, this is definitely a number oriented story, as almost the complete opposite of the last story. There's a ton of numbers. It is a very combat-oriented story, though. And again, the game mechanics of the combat are described very early in the story. They're really interesting. There's a gem system that allows game characters to be customized, giving them unique abilities, bonuses, and it allows for a lot of character customization. And again, it's a gem slotting system. And then characters actually on the fly or in the middle of combat change out the gems that they use in their weapons or armor and get a new build in the middle of combat. If you're familiar with other actual real virtual reality MMOs, this is very similar to a rune system in other games. So I like this particular game mechanic. It's unique. It gave these characters a lot of flexibility and that they weren't pegged into a particular class, at least for the most part. And I like that part of it. Now, there's also a romance aspect to the story, which I thought was always cute, although it does take most of the story to get going. It's a cute budding romance between the main character Max and Kylia. It's adorable. Liked it a lot. Okay, now on to things I didn't really enjoy as much about the story, or things that I thought just could have been done better. There are a ton of quotes from people before the chapters. Most of them are just annoying. I mean, the first few times, like, oh, that's interesting. You get a little side view of somebody outside of the story, or some designer or game designer or just some person. But with a very rare exception, they don't really add anything to the story. They don't give insight in the minds of the game designers for the most part. They might describe a particular game mechanic, but again, very rarely are they applicable or interesting, or they don't really add anything to the story. So I thought for the most part they were kind of unnecessary and almost distracting. Now, another thing I didn't really enjoy, or I thought it could have been number, was that Max in the story is supposed to be under a tremendous amount of pressure to pay his family's bills through online gameplay, but I never really felt the urgency of it. He states several times that if he doesn't pay the bills, that he's going to lose his assistant care provider. There's a woman who lives with him in the real world, who helps him and his sister deal with the medical issues, helps take care of them, helps clean and cook, and provides medical care for them. But because their financial situation is changing within the medical system, they might lose her if Max doesn't make enough money, and he might not be able to pay the bills for his apartment. He might have to move into to assisted living housing, which is not good for them. But again, that urgency is never really felt in the way that he plays the game, which is kind of a missed opportunity for me, because he says he plays the game to make money, but he only really explores one or two avenues of making that money within the story concept. One, he basically hires himself out as a mercenary for other rich kids who want a power level, basically, or go on a specific quest. He's the tank to go to. And he sometimes sells some of the gems and equipment he finds in these quests to make a little side cash. But there are just so many ways of making money in a game. I would have thought that he would have at least tried or described that he had done them at some point in the past, and he should find that, oh, this is just the optimal path. He could have made characters and sold them off. Within the context of the story, that's not exactly possible, or is it? It's not really made 100% clear. If he was really super interested in making a ton of money, he would have researched the absolute best path to make it. And that it really doesn't come across as something the main character did. It just kind of bothered me a little bit. That's supposed to be his motivation, but it doesn't really come across as being that important necessarily. Additionally, because the story starts off with Max already being a higher level character, the story kind of misses an opportunity to introduce the reader to the game world as the character's exploring, as he's choosing a class, as he's figuring out how the gem system works, as he's going after those initial mobs. And again, that's a story choice. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad story choice. I just think it's a missed opportunity, because you don't really get a feel for the game world as a whole. You're just getting a very small slice of it as like end game content, and that's it. It's an opinion. Again, it didn't necessarily make it a bad story, just a missed opportunity in my opinion. And again, speaking of missed opportunities. Again, this is a very narrow piece of a potentially large game world. Most of the story is very, again, combat-oriented situations. The majority of the time in-game is spent either theory crafting the best way to utilize ability-giving gems, updating quests, or in combat furthering the new expansion quest arc. No real time is taken to flesh out the larger world. The other things that people do in games like this, like exploration, crafting, trading, rare item hunters, guild battles, player versus player combat, none of that's really explored within this world. And again, it becomes like a very narrow, limiting view into this MMORPG, which is kind of sad because the game itself seems like it's potentially fascinating and interesting. And I just would have loved to have learned more about that as well. Okay, a big point that's brought up again and again within the story, but it's never really seems that important, is neural hacking. This is not just a full immersion of virtual reality game. Apparently, the game system reads players' minds, and it actually taps into their minds directly. And again, it's being brought up a number of times in the story that people don't give their real life information to other characters or other players because bad people can use that information to hack their brain. And as a kind of sci-fi cyberpunk theme, it's cool, but it doesn't seem to be interesting or used at all in the story other than vague futuristic warning of neural implant stuff. Again, missed opportunity to me. If it's not going to be like a real big part of the story, why really bring it up? You know what I mean? One of the few ways that characters can exchange personal information is if they get a ring of promise, which is the title of the story. And if they can quest for this ring of promise, then they can gradually reveal more and more personal information to another character. But other than that, the game itself is supposed to have an infallible filter system because it's reading their brains that stops people from either revealing anything about their real life selves or cursing, which is kind of an odd game filter in my opinion. And the filter system kind of becomes an issue for me as well. It seems seriously unrealistic and unnecessary. In my opinion, there's nothing that's ever really going to stop people from doing something within a system that they want to do. If people want, to me as a gamer, it seems totally natural and normal for eventually the people you play quests with or you guild with, you want to get to know them better. You want to actually spend time together, or you just want to learn real things about each other. And yes, bad people can do bad things with that information. But to have an entire filter system that literally stops you from saying things seems not only unnecessary, but also unrealistic. There's no system that's ever been created that a tech genius or just a creative mind can't get around. And so the fact that this can't be gotten around within the story just seems a little unrealistic to me. I mean, why could somebody just, because I'll describe to you in the game, if somebody tries to say something about their personal information or curse, the game actually replaces their words with gibberish or just random words, which is kind of a fun joke within the story. But why couldn't somebody just use sign language or create a personal code that the game system can't figure out, or have third-party software inserted that kind of circumvents that, or a message system, or meeting people in real life and then gaming together and talking about your contact information or your real life stuff outside of game, or there's just so many ways around. It just kind of bothered me as being unnecessary to the story, because it doesn't really add anything. It just kind of ends up being a running gag throughout the story, a way for people to curse without cursing. So it is what it is. But again, it's just something that kind of stuck out of my brain as being, okay, that's interesting. Again, there's nothing really wrong with the story in a technical sense, but there's just a lot of little things that made the story not click for me. Again, this is not a bad story. It just, for some reason, including the ones I mentioned, it didn't click in my mind as appealing to me in a super abundant way, besides my general level of LitRPG. So for that reason, gets a 6 out of 10. But I encourage you to go check it out for yourself. Maybe it appeals to you. Maybe things about the story just click for you better. But for me, That's the rating, or the score I give it, 6 out of 10. So there you go. That's it. We're done. Finished. I know. If you can follow us, if you're interested in the podcast, we have a Facebook page, LitRPGpodcast.com. We have a Twitter, YouTube, Patreon. We'll have links in the show notes for all those things if you want to check them out. And again, you can support us on Patreon as well. If you want the full show notes for the podcast, they should be below somewhere on Facebook, or I'll link on them in the show notes. That goes to our website at geekbystpodcast.com. But again, that's it. Thanks for hanging out with me, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, we are finished. And until I can hang out with you again and talk about this thing that I love, remember to go read some LitRPG. Goodbye, everybody.